The shadow crept silently. Gunnar froze, his knuckles white as he gripped the axe handle. Something moved in the woods. Perhaps it was just the wind rustling through the endless sea of pines and birches that surrounded them. They had been in this cursed land for 3 days, far from the familiar waters of the fjords where Norse longships ruled. 3 days ago, they had dragged their longship ashore at the mouth of an unnamed river, eager to plunder riches in these eastern lands. 6 of their comrades were dead. Sámi made him whirl around, his heart pounding beneath his mail shirt. Nothing. Only more trees. The forest was a maze of tangled roots and moss-covered stones, but seemed to shift beneath their feet. Even the air felt different here, heavier, watchful. They are but mortals, Harald had boasted as they dragged the ship ashore. Savages living in the woods, who have never faced true warriors. Now Harald's head adorned a spear somewhere, his famous red beard knotted with blood, his eyes pecked clean by crows. The attack came at dawn. Not a battle of shield minus walls and war cries, but silent death from the trees. Arrows tipped with bone and flint, throwing spears of uncanny accuracy, and then they were gone, melting back into the forest before the Vikings could even form ranks. They are demons, Eric whispered that night, huddled by the weak fire. These are not men. They speak with the trees. They become the shadows. Gunnar had punched him then, angry at the superstition, that now as another arrow hissed from nowhere to bury itself in the tree trunk, just inches from his face, he wondered if Eric had been right. A horn sounded in the distance. Not the deep bellow of a Norse war horn, but something higher, wilder. Others answered it, until the forest seemed to echo with their call, impossible to locate, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. The forest folk were closing in. These Vikings had faced kings and armies, seas and empires, but nothing had prepared them for an enemy without walls, without banners, without faces. In the forest, even the air seemed to breathe against them. Each step deeper into the woods felt like stepping into another world, one that cared nothing for Norse steel or courage. The ground beneath their boots was soft and shifting, swallowing their footing like something alive. Birds fell silent as they passed. The canopy above swallowed the sunlight so completely that midday felt like dusk. Even the wind sounded different here, a sigh through the branches that spoke a language older than humankind. The men spoke less now. The bold talk that had filled the voyage had dwindled to muttered curses under the breath. Some claimed to have seen shapes moving at the edge of sight, watchers who disappeared before a gaze could lock. Others swore the forest itself moved as they did, shifting to confuse their path. Gunnar had heard tales of shape-minus shifters who could change between man and beast, and of elves who lured foreign invaders to lose themselves until hunger or madness consumed them. He had dismissed them as peasant superstition, but now, with every unseen arrow and rustle in the dark, those stories pressed heavier on his mind. For the first time in his life, this warrior who had raided the Frankish coast and sailed the storm-minus North Sea felt a thought colder than steel. This was not his world, and perhaps never would be. The Vikings, those legendary Norse warriors who terrorized much of Europe from the late 8th to the mid-11th century, dominate on modern imagination as unstoppable conquerors. Their long ships carried them across vast distances, from North America to the Mediterranean, from the British Isles to the rivers of Rus. Yet, history reveals a more complex truth. Norse expansion met its match in the dense forests covering much of northern and eastern Europe. These woodlands were home to peoples who refused to bend the knee to the Viking axe. These cultures turned their forest homelands into fortresses and themselves into the stuff of Norse nightmares. While the Vikings mastered the sea, these forest dwellers mastered a terrain that nullified many Norse advantages, turning hunters into the hunted. Resistance to Viking expansion came from diverse cultural groups across Europe's great forest belt. In the north and east, Finnic peoples, including Finns, Karelians and Estonians, inhabited the dense northern forest, stretching from modern Finland into northwestern Russia. Nearby, the Sámi people operated in northern Scandinavia itself, masters of the taiga and tundra. Baltic peoples, Lithuanians, Latvians, and Old Prussians controlled the forests south of the Gulf of Finland, fiercely guarding their ancestral lands. Meanwhile, in the western forests on the other side of the continent, Celtic peoples like the Picts in Scotland and Irish tribes also developed forest warfare tactics against Viking invaders. Between these regions, Slavic tribes in Eastern Europe used dense woodlands, from Poland to Ukraine, as natural strongholds against raiders coming up the river systems. These forest cultures shared neither language nor direct cultural ties, yet all developed strikingly similar methods of resisting the terror from the sea. Their story reveals how deep knowledge of local terrain could overcome even the most fierce military technology, a lesson repeated throughout history, but seldom told from the perspective of those who successfully resisted conquest. The Vikings' greatest advantages, mobility and shock tactics, became their greatest weaknesses when they ventured into the shadowy realms of the forest peoples. Here, in the dappled light of ancient trees, the hunters of the north were about to become hunted. The Norse had toppled kingdoms and shattered armies, but here, they found no king to ransom, no throne to seize, only shadows that refused to kneel. And those shadows struck back. The Viking worldview was forged on open seas and wind-swept European coasts. Their enemies were walled cities, unrivaled warlords, visible targets to be met head-on. The forest peoples did not play by those rules. To the Norse, they were not states in their understanding. No great halls to burn, no kings to slay, no tribute to demand, and that unnerved them more than anything. How do you conquer a people who melt into the trees, whose power comes not from fortresses, but from the very landscape itself? Daily expeditions into these woodlands returned home with unsettling tales. Some ships never came back. Farish and Burkund by whispered of raiders who vanished without a trace. Their long ships found abandoned on riverbanks, their crews seemingly swallowed by the earth. Others spoke of warriors driven mad, claiming the forest whispered their names in tongues they didn't understand, or that their own weapons turned against them after crossing sacred ground. It was in these encounters that the Norse first began using terms like forest dweller with the wary respect they once reserved for rival chieftains. These were not enemies who would meet them in glorious battle. These were people who would refuse battle altogether until it was fought on their terms, in a place where Norse power meant nothing. Gradually, a realization spread across Scandinavia. Brute force alone was not enough here. Conquering the forest required something far more elusive and far more dangerous, something more perilous than steel. The wind carried strange scents, in resin wood smoke, and something else human, yet foreign. Astrid pressed herself lower into the undergrowth, her fingers steady on her bow. He had lived 20 summers, all of them in these woods that outsiders now dared to enter. The strangers called themselves Russ, men from beyond the eastern sea, building settlements at river mouths. But the elders whispered other names, Angians, Vikings, wolves come to steal and kill, they would learn. The forest did not welcome those who did not respect its laws. Ahead, she could see them, 8 men and male, carrying shields painted with strange patterns. They moved clumsily through the brush, their heavy boots slipping on moss-covered stones, their voices too loud in the sacred stillness of the trees. They were following the old hunting trail that led to her village, clearly guided by a betrayer among the forest folk. Astrid touched the small wooden carving at her throat, a bear, the symbol of her clan. Then she gave a bird call, 3 short whistles, a pause, 1 long. Around her, the forest seemed to come alive as 20 tribal warriors, just visible enough to confirm the signal, vanished back into perfect stillness. The trap was set. The forest would feast today. Archaeological evidence reveals the sophisticated defensive strategies employed by forest cultures against Viking incursions. Unlike the stone fortifications of Western Europe, forest peoples often relied on what archaeologists call promontory for its natural defensive positions, strengthened with wooden palisades and earthworks. In Finland and Estonia, is Helfer Tafsrasvatita a place to control key waterways, the very routes Viking ships needed to navigate. Excavations at sites like Valjala and Estonia reveal impressive fortifications that could shelter entire communities during raids. These were not just defensive positions but centers of resistance, where forest peoples could gather, organize, and launch counterattacks against Norse invaders. Finds suggest these sites were continually improved over generations, indicating a sustained response to the Viking threat, not a panic-driven reaction. The material culture found at these sites tells a story of both resistance and cultural intermingling. The forest peoples did not just resist Viking technology, they adapted it, improved it, and turned it against its creators. Arrowheads found at several Baltic and Finnic sites show distinctive local designs, optimized for hunting and fighting in dense forest conditions, lighter, sharper, designed to pierce the gaps in mail armor rather than smash through shields. Perhaps most telling are the defensive sites themselves. Unlike the coastal defenses of Western Europe built to withstand sieges, many forest fortifications were designed with multiple escape routes, hinting at a people who understood survival sometimes meant strategic retreat rather than holding ground to the last. The forest itself was their great ally, a living labyrinth that could swallow whole communities when necessary and let them reign Inus emerge once danger had passed. The Vikings, these were not primitive barricades. They were invisible fortresses that rose and fell with the seasons, breathing unchanging like the forest itself. While Europe's stone castles stood as static monuments to power, the forest peoples mastered a more flexible form of defense, one that the Vikings, for all their strength, could neither predict nor destroy. Their fortifications were not designed to intimidate invaders, but to erase them. Viking band might trek through the woods for days, thinking themselves alone, only to stumble upon earthen ramparts and sharpened stakes as if conjured from thin air. Sites like Valjala in Estonia reveal that forts were not simple refuges. They were command centers, marketplaces, and spiritual sanctuaries, combined places where warriors gathered, scouts relayed intelligence, and shamans performed rituals to sanctify the defense. Archaeological layers show repeated rebuilding over centuries, suggesting these structures were not desperate, temporary reactions but part of a long-term military tradition. Further north in Finland, Helfortests like Rock Killian Kark, IJ were deliberately built to control narrow portages between lakes and rivers, the very lifelines Viking ships depended on to penetrate inland. Some were placed in natural bottlenecks where steep ravines or dense thickets restricted the maneuverability of the Norse shield wall. Others were connected by hidden rails and signal mounds, allowing defenders to coordinate movements across vast distances without exposing their numbers. These were not the static castles the Vikings were accustomed to storming. They were part of a larger defensive system spanning the land, integrating terrain, communities, and tactics into a single weapon. Approaching them was not just attacking a wall, it was challenging an entire landscape shaped to reject outsiders. From Norse sagas, though written from a Viking perspective, and inadvertently reveal the effectiveness of these tactics. In Egil's saga, the famed warrior Minusboa describes a disastrous expedition into KVEN land northern Finland, where his band was attacked by forest dwellers who seemed to materialize from the trees themselves. The saga describes the KVENs as fighting not as men of honor, but as shadows and ghosts, striking without warning, vanishing before our swords could find them. This was not warfare as the Vikings knew it. It was something else entirely. A form of resistance perfectly adapted to the environmental and cultural realities of the forest world. Steel could be parried, arrows could be dodged. But how do you fight an enemy that invades your mind? The forest tribes didn't just fight the Vikings, they rewrote the rules of fear. For all their ferocity, the Norse were immortal, and mortals fight worst when uncertain. The forest peoples understood this deeply. They aimed not merely to kill the enemy, but to unrattle them, to have the land itself whisper their doom before the first spear was thrown. Fighting the Vikings physically was difficult, but making them doubt their senses, question their gods, fear the dark they once mocked that was more devastating. Reports filtered back to Scandinavia of riding parties returning half-mad. Tales of faces watching them from bark, campfires that wouldn't light, strange light-dances in the woods that lured them off the path. In the Yngling saga, a chieftain describes a deafening silence broken only by the distant rhythmic beating of drums that seemed to echo inside his skull. Another claimed his warriors fell into waking nightmares, visions of wolves trailing them through the underbrush. Yao eyes always just out of reach. Even the fiercest berserkers were not immune. Some refused to enter certain regions after witnessing what they believed were shape-shifters, warriors appearing inhuman, from only to disappear as beasts. Others carried charms against land-spirits or carved runes into their shields not to ward off enemies, but to protect their minds from the forest itself. The defenders deliberately fostered these fears. Ritual masks from brick and bone, painted with ochre, were left at crossroads. One night, drum beats sounded from shifting locations, making it impossible to judge how many warriors surrounded them. Manimal calls echoed from unexpected places, confusing the enemy's sense of direction. To the Vikings, these were signs of witchcraft. Perhaps in a sense, they were. It was a warfare that weaponized the unknown, turning superstition into strategy. The result was a subtle but devastating shift. These raiders who had once spread terror wherever they landed now found themselves haunted. Every creak of wood, every shadow between trees could be the enemy. And once fear took root in a warrior's heart, the forest no longer needed to fight him. It had already won. The first time something was wrong was when helped unnoticed the Britsung stepped. He was the youngest in the raiding party, on his first expedition east of the Baltic, eager to prove himself to the older warriors. The silence hit him immediately, an unnatural hush that fell over the forest like a shroud. He opened his mouth to warn the others, but it was too late. The first Viking fell with a choked cry, an arrow sprouting from his throat. The second and third went down almost simultaneously, one pierced through the chest by a spear, the other with an axe embedded in his skull. Shield minus wall, bellowed Bjorn Ironside, the expedition leader, but there was no time and no space to form that protective formation that had served them so well on open battlefields. Here, among the trees, they were apparated, disoriented, their long swords catching on low-hanging branches, their shields too cumbersome to maneuver between the closely packed chunks. Halfdan raised his shield just in time to block a stone-step tarot that would have taken his eye. He caught a glimpse of movement, a figure in furs with symbols painted on his face in patterns he didn't recognize, melting back into the undergrowth before he could even point his sword in that direction. "They're everywhere," someone screamed, and they were appearing from behind trees, dropping from branches, rising from the forest floor where they had lain motionless, cloaked in moss and leaves. This was not the kind of fighting Halfdan had been taught. This was slaughter. The resistance of forest peoples to Viking expansion was not merely physical, it was psychological. They understood that to defeat the Norse raiders, they needed to become something more than human in Viking eyes. They needed to transform into the demons that haunted Norse nightmares. This psychological dimension of the resistance appears repeatedly in Norse sources. I am eskring describes an expedition into BJ Armel and the land of the Finnic peoples near the White Sea when Norse warriors were plagued by visions and unnatural sounds that drove some to madness. While modern historians might attribute such accounts to natural disorientation in an unfamiliar forest, to the Vikings of the time, they genuinely believed they faced supernatural opposition. This belief was not entirely without basis. Forest cultures across the north practiced spiritual traditions radically different from Norse paganism. Where the Vikings worshipped gods of war, thunder, and the sea, forest peoples venerated spirits of the land, ancestors, and animals. Their shamanic practices involving trance states, beliefs in animal transformation, and communication with nature spirits appeared as dark sorcery to Norse observers. Archaeological finds support this cultural divide. Ritual sites in Finnish and Baltic territories reveal evidence of practices that would have seemed alien to Norse sensibilities, sacrifices to forest spirits, sacred groves where trees could not be cut, and ceremonial objects depicting human-animal hybrid figures. These spiritual differences themselves became weapons, as forest peoples deliberately amplified the supernatural aspects of their culture when confronting the Vikings. The Sámi, the indigenous people of northern Scandinavia, were particularly feared for their perceived magical abilities. This fear was so profound that even as the Vikings achieved military dominance over much of Europe, and maintained uneasy trade relationships with Sámi communities rather than attempting conquest. Forest sources mention Sámi shamans, no-aid-I, with a mixture of fear and respect, attributing to them the power to control weather, shape-shift into animals, and cast deadly curses that could follow Vikings across the sea. This psychological warfare extended to combat tactics. Forest warriors often adorned themselves with animal parts, bear claws, wolf teeth, antlers, not just as status symbols, but to project a terrifying supernatural image during battle. Archaeological evidence from several sites reveals masks and headdresses that served no practical defensive purpose, but would have created a dreadful impression during an ambush or night raid. The forest itself became part of this psychological arsenal to the use of bird calls to communicate, silent movement across terrain that made Norse warriors stumble and curse, and appearing to materialize from the trees themselves. Forest defenders cultivated an aura of the supernatural that amplified their actual military capabilities. They have eyes in the backs of their heads, the BJRN grumbled, binding a rough bandage around the wound in his arm, where a storm-stepped tail had passed through flesh. They see in the dark. They talk to the birds and beasts. The survivors of the riding party, now less than half their original number, had retreated to a small clearing by a stream. 3 days of being hunted through endless trees had left them exhausted, jumpy at shadows, their legendary Norse scourge wearing thin with every passing hour. Nonsense, Hakon growled, though his voice lacked conviction. They are men, nothing more. Men who know these cursed woods. Did you see their eyes? Eric asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The one who killed Gunnar, his eyes were yellow, like a wolf's, and the markings on their skin, that isn't tattooing like ours. That spell's written in blood. Enough. Hakon slammed the haft of his axe against a tree. We are Vikings. If we do not fear forest rats who hide in shadows. But even as he said it, his eyes darted nervously along the wall of trees surrounding them. The forest seemed to listen, to watch, to wait. The darkness between the trunks held secrets and threats that no Norse warrior could decipher. That night, they heard the drums, distant at first, then closer. A rhythm that seemed to match the beating of their own hearts, that seemed to call to something pale and fearful in their blood. As the drums came voices, chanting in a tongue none of them knew, rising and falling like wind through branches. No one slept. They sat with weapons in hand, back to back, watching the dark. Twice, they thought they saw eyes reflecting the firelight, not human eyes, but something else, something that vanished when they looked directly. Dawn, two more men were gone, taken from their very midst without a sound, without a struggle. Where BJRN had been sitting, they found only his helmet, filled with fresh gathered pine needles arranged in a pattern that looked disturbingly like a grinning face. The resistance of forest peoples was not merely reactive, it was strategic. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests they developed sophisticated methods for dealing with Viking incursions, methods that evolved over generations. Far from primitive reactions, these strategies reveal a deep understanding of the principles of asymmetric warfare that military theorists today would recognize. One key strategy was information control. Forest cultures recognized that knowledge about waterways, portages, and settlements was valuable intelligence the Vikings desperately needed. They developed systems to monitor their territory, using watchers and beacon fires to spread warnings quickly when longships were spotted. Archaeological remains of these early warning systems have been found in Finland and parts of Russia, often positioned on high ground overlooking navigable rivers, the preferred invasion routes of the Vikings. Forest peoples also practiced what modern military strategists would call defense in depth. Rather than concentrating their strength in coastal settlements where Vikings might land, They created multiple layers of defense extending deep into the forest. Initial contact might be made by small scouting parties who would harass Viking forces, followed by ambushes at predictable bottlenecks like river and arrows or portages, culminating in larger defensive actions near major settlements. Evidence for these tactics comes from both archaeological finds and Norse accounts. The distribution of weapon finds and defensive structures throughout forest territory suggests societies organized for multi-layered territorial defense. Meanwhile, Norse sources repeatedly complain about the difficulty of forcing forest peoples into a decisive battle, revealing the effectiveness of these elusive defensive methods. Perhaps most sophisticated was the forest people's understanding of resource denial. They recognized that Vikings, as raiders from distant lands, relied on local resources to sustain prolonged operations. By removing food stores, burning their own outlying settlements when necessary, and poisoning water sources, they created an increasingly hostile environment for Norse expeditions penetrating deep into forest territory. The Finnic peoples in particular developed an expertise in what could be termed environmental warfare, using their intimate knowledge of local terrain. They lured Viking bands into natural hazards bonds, dead-minus sands, areas with dangerous wildlife. In winter, they used their superior ability to move over snow on skis, evidence of which archaeologists date to 3000 BCE in Finnish territory to attack Norse parties struggling through deep drifts. These methods required significant social organization and cultural adaptation. The threat of Viking raids appears to have accelerated the political development of many forest societies, leading to more centralized leadership and regional cooperation. Archaeological evidence shows an increase in fortification building on weapons production during the Viking Age, suggesting societies rapidly organizing to meet an existential threat. The result was a form of resistance that made conquest prohibitively costly for Viking expeditions. While raids might yield temporary gains, establishing permanent control over forest territory proved nearly impossible. The forest peoples did not think in terms of days or campaigns. They thought in generations. To defeat the Sámi wolves, they turned an entire landscape into a weapon and their way of life into a war plan. This was not improvisation. It was strategy woven into the very fabric of their society. Every village elder hunter and scout played a part in a larger defensive network beyond the comprehension of any Viking chieftain. They did not concentrate their power in a single fortified place. They dispersed it across the land and through time. Along key rivers, watchers were built on high ridges where sentries could spot distant sails days before ships arrived. Signal smokes, beacon fires, and carved wooden totems relayed warnings faster than any horse could ride. Villages could vanish into the woods within hours, taking livestock, food stores, and sacred objects, leaving nothing of value for the invaders to seize. The deeper the Vikings pushed inland, the more difficult their campaigns became. Carefully laid traps awaited at predictable choke points, deadfall pits hidden beneath leaf litter, thorough bridges designed to collapse under heavy loads. Even artificial marshes were created by diverting streams to flood lowlands. Scouts would harass them constantly, striking at foraging parties and supply areas, then disappearing before a counterattack could be organized. The raiders were forced to burn precious energy and provisions simply trying to stay alive. Some tactics bordered on psychological sabotage. Entire regions were stripped bare ahead of Viking arrival. Wells poisoned, storage pits emptied, animal herds driven into distant valleys. When the Norse came looking for plunder, they found only abandoned huts and silent forests. The message was clear: there would be no glory here, no easy riches, no decisive victory. This long-term approach demanded organization and communication, far beyond what outsiders expected of tribal societies. But it worked. The Vikings thrived on decisive clashes and quick loot. Forest peoples denied them both. They turned every mile into an ordeal, every victory into a Pyrrhic one. Slowly, inevitably, the cost of conquest began to outweigh the rewards. The forest peoples had transformed their entire way of life into a defensive system that could absorb attacks, adapt to Viking tactics, and ultimately exhaust the invaders will to continue. Morning mist rose from the lake like ghostly fingers as Freydis guided her small fleet of 3 long ships toward the forested shore. He stood at the prow, her red hair streaming in the dawn breeze, her hand on the sword at her hip. Behind her, 60 warriors readied their weapons, their voices hushed in the eerie stillness. This was her first command, an eastern venture her father had warned against. The fiercest Vikings, he'd told her, the scars on his face whitening with his frown. If you seek glory, take your ship south to the rich Frankish lands. Afraid is it heard stories of golden furs from the great lakes beyond the settlements, and she was determined to succeed where others had failed. She had studied the accounts of previous expeditions unlearned from their mistakes. He would not venture deep into the wilds. Instead, they would strike quickly at the lakeside settlement their scouts had identified, then return to the safety of their ships. The village came into view through the thinning mist, a cluster of wooden buildings with steep roofs, smoke rising lazily from central hearths. No walls protected us. No warriors stood guard. It looked almost too easy. Something is wrong, her lieutenant. Have R.D. muttered. Where are all the people? He was right. The village appeared deserted. No children playing. No women at morning work. No fishermen preparing nets. Yet smoke still rose from the buildings. They left recently. Perhaps they fled when they saw us coming, Freydis suggested, though doubt crept into her voice. They beached the ships and cautiously approached, shields ready, forming the wedge formation that had broken so many enemy lines. The silence was absolute, save for the crunch of boots on the gravel shore and the distant call of a bird that seemed to echo across the lake. The first building they entered was empty, food still warm in cooking pots. The second, the same. By the third, Freydis felt the hair rising on the back of her neck. This wasn't abandonment. This was a trap. The bird call came again, answered by another, then another, and Freydis suddenly understood. He went bird call said, back to the ships, she shouted. That the words had barely left her mouth when the forest sedge erupted with movement. Dozens of figures emerged, not charging wildly as most enemies would, but advancing in disciplined formation, armed with spears, bows, and strange curved blades. What struck Freydis most was their silence. No war cries, no shouted challenges, only the steady, inexorable advance of warriors whose faces were painted with symbols that seemed to shift and change in the morning light. And behind them, emerging from the woods like a spirit, came a figure unlike any Freydis had ever seen, taller than the others, clad in a cloak of feathers and animal skins, wearing a headdress adorned with antlers and bones. In one hand he held a staff topped with a human skull, an oarsman's skull, beard still attached. The shaman raised the staff, and the silent warriors stopped as one. Then he spoke, his voice carrying across the distance, in a language Freydis did not understand, but which somehow chilled her blood more than any battle-minus cry could have done. What did he say? She asked the Estonian slave who served as translator. The man had gone pale. He says the forest has been waiting for you. He says your ships will make good firewood and your bones good tools. Freydis raised her shield as the first arrows began to fly. The Battle of H8 Aostaro stands as perhaps the most well-documented encounter between Viking forces and forest defenders, preserved in both Norse sagas and local oral traditions later, recorded by medieval chroniclers. While historical accounts vary in details, archaeological evidence from the site in what is now Estonia provides tangible confirmation of this remarkable clash that occurred around 1035 CE. According to the saga of Magnus the Good, a substantial Norse expedition, led by chieftain Avald Odoran's son, with 12 long ships and nearly 700 warriors, a significant force by Viking standards, ventured into the eastern territories. Their target was the wealthy trading settlement at H8 Aostara, which controlled important amber and fruit trade routes. But what they encountered instead became a legendary episode in the resistance against Viking expansion. Estonian defenders, according to later Estonian chronicles led by a war chief named Lamio, had prepared an elaborate ambush. Archaeological evidence reveals a sophisticated trap. The Estonians constructed a series of concealed earthworks and palisades in a horseshoe formation, with the open end facing the lake where Viking ships would land. Free cover was selectively cleared to create what appeared to be an inviting approach to the settlement, while maintaining hidden positions for defenders. The battle began conventionally enough, with the Vikings forming their famous shield wall and advancing toward the seemingly vulnerable settlement. What happened next transformed a routine raid into a catastrophe for the Norse forces. At a signal described in the saga as a horn minus call like no earthly instrument, the trap was sprung. Estonian warriors emerged from concealed positions, while others attacked from behind, having circled through the forest to cut off the Vikings' retreat to their ships. Archaeological excavations at the site have uncovered hundreds of arrowheads in a concentrated pattern, suggesting a massive volley attack, a tactic rarely associated with primitive forest peoples, but clearly employed at Hk to devastating effect. More telling are the Norse artifacts found scattered along what appears to be a desperate retreat path toward the lake. Broken weapons, personal items, as silver hoards apparently abandoned in flight. The saga reports only 3 ships and fewer than 100 warriors escaped the slaughter. While this may be exaggerated for dramatic effect, archaeological evidence does suggest a decisive victory for the forest defenders. Among the most striking finds are several elaborately decorated Viking swords that were ritually bent and buried in what appears to be a victory ceremony, a practice documented in other Finnic cultures as a way of killing the enemy's weapon and claiming its power. The Vikings called it a raid. The forest people called it a reckoning. Aethbara was more than a battle. It was a trap that shattered the myth of Norse invincibility. The ambush at Hk was more than a military victory. It was a masterpiece of planning, patience, and psychological warfare. Weeks before the Vikings arrived, scouts had mapped their likely approach, counting ships from hidden riverbanks, tracking their movements without ever being seen. The Estonian defenders had even planted false trails of abandoned camps, empty storehouses and livestock pens left deliberately visible to lure the invaders deeper inland. By the time Thorvald Ko Duran's sons first reached the settlement, every step of their advance had been anticipated. Some accounts suggest the defenders even allowed the Vikings to capture a few small villages on purpose, empty settlements that bolstered Norse confidence and convinced them the region was weak. Only when the Norse had committed their full strength inland did the trap close. On the first shield wall advanced toward Aostaro's false gates, hundreds of warriors erupted from hidden wrenches and camouflage palisades, unleashing volleys of arrows and javelins in coordinated ways. One saga claims the sound of the ambush was so sudden and overwhelming, it seemed the forest itself roared. Warriors who tried to flee toward their ships found the shoreline blocked by felled trees and earthen barricades. Those who held their ground were swallowed by wave after wave of hit-and-run attacks, defenders retreating into the woods only to reappear at the flanks moments later. At nightfall, the Viking formations had broken down into scattered pockets. Isolated, unterrified, they were hunted through a landscape they did not understand. The few survivors who staggered back to their ships carried more than wounds. They carried stories of warriors who fought like spirits, but arrows that seemed to come from the trees themselves, at an enemy who not only defeated them, but humiliated them. The name Hk spread quickly through the Norse world, not as a place of glory, but as a warning. It was proof that even the fiercest kings could be brought low by people who understood the land better than they ever could. What makes Hk particularly significant is that it represents not just a successful defense, but a sophisticated military operation that required planning, coordination, and leadership qualities often denied to non-state societies in traditional historical accounts. The forest peoples had studied Viking tactics, identified their weaknesses, and developed a counter strategy that played to their own strengths. The psychological impact of the Hk defeat rippled through Norse society. Sagas note that following this disaster, wise chieftains counseled against ventures into the eastern forests unless with overwhelming force and local guides, suggesting a significant reassessment of the risks associated with raiding these territories. For the Estonian defenders, This victory became a founding legend of resistance that would inspire opposition to subsequent invaders for centuries. The raven watched from its perch on a lightning-struck pine as the last of the strangers died. The Iron Men had come in their wooden dragons 3 days before, their axes and swords gleaming in the summer sun, their voices loud and harsh in the sacred silence of the forest. There they lay scattered among the trees, their blood feeding the moss, their fine mail shirts and helmets stripped from cooling bodies. Below the raven's perch, Juk surveyed the aftermath of the ambush, his face impassive beneath the ritual paint that marked him as a Taitage, a keeper of the old magic. 40 summers he had lived in these forests, learning their secrets, speaking with the spirits of tree and stone, water and air. When the strangers came from the sea, it was Juko who had read the signs, who had prepared the people. Out the dead, he instructed his nephew, "Va, I know, ensuring none escaped to bring more of their kind. Va, I know," nodded and moved among the fallen Vikings, checking each body with practiced efficiency. The young man had fought well, his spear finding 3 of the invaders during the frenzied moments when the trap closed around them. 20 to here, yea, I know, reported upon his return. 3 or fell into the bog when they tried to flee eastward. The water spirits have the now. Juko nodded, satisfaction in his eyes. At I'm Lathuth, for wounded none fiercely. Eliki took an axe blow to Herschel dome, but the bone is not broken. Tapia was struck by an arrow, but his elk-hide armor turned it aside. It had been a good day's work. The forest had protected its own, as it always did. These Northmen, these self-proclaimed masters of the world, had learned what so many before them had discovered, that in the shadow of ancient pines, of vaunted strength met little. Juko knelt beside the body of what appeared to be the Viking leader, a massive man with intricate tattoos covering his arms and a silver Thor's hammer hanging from a chain around his neck. In death, his face was frozen in an expression of surprise rather than fear. He had died without understanding what had happened to him. Take their weapons and anything of value, Juko instructed the warriors gathering around him, but leave their bodies for the forest. It has earned its feast today. As his people set about the grim work of stripping the dead, Juko walked to the edge of the clearing where the ambush had taken place. Beyond lay the path that would have led the Vikings to the village, had they lived long enough to find it. He placed his hand against the rough bark of an ancient pine, feeling the slow, patient life within it. "They will come again," he murmured as much to the tree as to himself. "They always come again. These men from beyond the sea. But we will be waiting. We have always been waiting." Above him, the raven called once and took flight, a black shadow against the endless green canopy of the northern forest. The resistance of forest peoples against Viking expansion represents one of history's most successful examples of asymmetric warfare, a conflict where a militarily weaker force defeats a stronger one by exploiting environmental advantages and alternative tactics. While modern historical accounts often focus on where Vikings succeeded in establishing settlements and trade networks, equally important is understanding where and why they failed. The forest societies developed layered approaches to defense that combined physical, psychological, and spiritual elements. Their success relied not on matching Viking military might directly, but on transforming the conflict into one where Norse advantages became irrelevant or even liabilities. Linguistically, we find evidence of this resistance embedded in Norse terminology itself. The Old Norse word finvitka, literally fin-demon, described a mythological monster with the upper body of a human and lower body of an animal. This term's etymology reveals how thoroughly the forest peoples of the north had been transformed in the Norse imagination into supernatural threats. Similarly, Norse accounts frequently described forest peoples using terms associated with magic and otherworldly powers. Gengrad, a magical staff, Alefer elf, Sakonos orceries, Magigi Arcene Inus witch, and Hammer and Emmer shape shifter, able to change form. Archaeological evidence from Viking burials in regions bordering forest territories reveals interesting defensive and spiritual adaptations. Amulets specifically designed to ward off forest magic appear with greater frequency in these frontier regions. Some Viking graves and Eastern trading posts contain protective runic inscriptions specifically mentioning forest spirits or demons, suggesting that even Vikings who regularly traveled these territories maintained a healthy fear of the supernatural forces they believed inhabited the deep woods. The forest people's resistance was not merely successful in military terms, but transformative in cultural ones. It forced Norse societies to develop new approaches to these regions, shifting from raiding to trading where possible. The extensive trade networks that eventually developed between Vikings and forest peoples, evidenced by the spread of Norse goods deep into forest territories and forest products in Viking settlements, suggest a relationship of mutual respect that evolved after initial conflicts proved too costly for Norse raiders. This pattern of resistance and adaptation played out differently across Europe's forest belt. In the West, Celtic peoples like the Picts developed their own approaches to forest defense, combining hit-and-run tactics with the use of natural barriers. The Pictish resistance was so effective that Vikings largely abandoned attempts to settle northern Scotland beyond coastal areas, despite establishing strong footholds in the Orkney and Shetland Islands. In the Baltic regions, forest peoples organized into increasingly sophisticated political structures in response to the Viking threat. Archaeological evidence shows intensified fortification construction and weapons production, suggesting societies rapidly militarizing to meet an existential challenge. By the late Viking Age, these developments had laid the groundwork for the emergence of more centralized states that would eventually become Latvia, Lithuania, and Prussia. The Vikings came for silver, slaves, and glory. What they left behind was something far more lasting: nations' myths and identities forged in defiance beneath the forest canopy. The forest resistance did more than repel Viking armies. It shaped the destiny of entire peoples. Societies that might otherwise have been erased or assimilated emerged from these centuries of struggle stronger, more unified, and more self-aware. The political structures that arose in the Baltic and Finnic regions were not imitations of Scandinavian kingship, but evolved forms of leadership built around defense, resource control, and alliance building. Chieftains became war leaders. War leaders became crowned kings not because they sought conquest, but because they had to coordinate resistance against it. This transformation had ripple effects far beyond the Viking Age. When the Teutonic Knights and Christian Crusaders swept into the Baltic centuries later, they encountered societies whose collective memory of resistance still burned bright. Strategies first honed against the Norse ambushed tactics, scorched earth withdrawals, forest fortresses were repurposed to fight the Crusaders with devastating effect. Even in the early modern era, these same tactics echoed in uprisings against Polish, Lithuanian, and Russian imperial control. The psychological legacy endured as well. Myths of clever forest spirits defeating arrogant outsiders became national folklore. The heroes of the Kaliva, the Estonian legends of Lammitiu, and the Sámi stories of shifting protectors all reflect historical memories of these struggles reframed not just as survival, but as triumph. Over time, these narratives became foundational to national identity, stories of small peoples standing their ground against overwhelming power. The influence extended into modern warfare. During the Winter War of 1939-40, Finnish ski troops used the same principles their ancestors once had, striking Soviet columns from hidden forest positions, disappearing before a counterattack, and letting the land itself exhaust the invader. Across centuries, the core idea remained unchanged. The forest was not just a battlefield. It was an ally, a weapon, and a teacher. Thus, the legacy of this resistance is not confined to ancient sagas or archaeological ruins. It is alive in the languages that survived, the borders that held, and the unbroken cultural traditions of peoples who refused to bow. It lives in the pride of nations that traced their independence not to empires they built, but to conquerors they repelled. Perhaps most remarkably, the Finnic peoples of what is now Finland maintained their cultural and territorial integrity throughout the Viking Age despite their proximity to Scandinavia. While trade relationships developed and some cultural exchange occurred, The Finnish interior remained effectively independent, a estimate to the effectiveness of their resistance strategies. The success of forest peoples in resisting Viking expansion challenges traditional narratives of European history and often peasant and urbanized societies as passive victims of more advanced cultures. The archaeological and historical record instead reveals sophisticated defenders who understood their strengths, recognized their enemies' weaknesses, and developed effective strategies that preserved their independence in one of history's most turbulent periods. Olafur Haraldsson, later known as Saint Olaf, stood at the prow of his ship as it navigated the narrow river, dense forest pressing in on both sides. 20 summers old and already a veteran of raids across Europe, he had fought Saxons, Franks, and English, earning a reputation as a fearsome warrior and clever tactician. But these eastern forests awakened something unfamiliar in his heart, a creeping dread he would never have admitted to his men. How much farther to the trading post? He called to Gunnar, the half-Finnish guide they had hired at great expense in Novgorod. The withered man shrugged, his eyes constantly scanning the shoreline. Half a day if the river remains clear. But we must be cautious. We enter Mari territory now. Olafur had heard of the Morris, a Finnic tribe said to be masters of forest magic, whose shamans could call bears to fight alongside them, and whose arrows always found their mark, guided by spirits. Superstitious nonsense, he told himself. Yet he found his hand strained to Thor's hammer that hung at his neck. They know we are here, Gunnar said quietly, nodding toward the shore where nothing visible moved among the trees. They have been watching since dawn. Let them watch, Olafur replied with forced confidence. He come to trade, not raid. He will find our silver acceptable regardless of their feelings toward us. Gunnar's expression suggested he was less certain, but he said nothing more. As the day wore on, Olafur became increasingly aware of the silence. No birds sang in the trees. No animals came to drink at the river's edge. Even the insects seemed to have abandoned the area. Only the steady splash of oars and water and the creaking of the ship's timbers broke the unnatural quiet. There, Gunnar pointed suddenly toward a bend in the river ahead. The trading post lies just beyond. Olafur squinted against the afternoon sun. Something was wrong. A thin column of smoke rose above the trees, not the robust smoke of cooking fires or workshops, but the wispy remnants of something that had burned itself out. As they rounded the bend, his fears were confirmed. The trading post, a collection of log buildings where Norse merchants exchanged silver and iron goods for furs and amber, was now little more than charred ruins. No bodies were visible, but the destruction was complete. The fire, one of his men suggested hopefully. Gunnar shook his head. A message, he said grimly. No, you really came, Norseman. Olafur felt the weight of eyes upon him. Not just his crew's questioning stares, but something else, something watching from the shadowed forest that pressed against the riverbank. He had indeed come with trade goods, but also with warriors and plans to establish a permanent Norse outpost that could control this valuable river route. Somehow the forest people had known his true intentions. We should turn back, Gunnar advised, real fear now evident in his voice before nightfall. But Olafur Haraldsson had never retreated in his life. We make camp here, he commanded. Post guards. Tomorrow we will see if any survivors have fled upriver. As his men reluctantly began preparations for the night, Olafur stood alone at the ship's rail, staring into the impenetrable wall of trees. For a moment, just a moment, he thought he saw faces looking back at him, painted with symbols he did not recognize, eyes reflecting the late afternoon sun like those of wolves rather than men. Then they were gone, if they had ever been there at all. But the message remained clear. He was not welcome here. This was Northland, not its forest. Here, other gods ruled, older gods who had no love for men from the sea. For the first time in his storied career of conquest, Olafur Haraldsson felt like prey rather than predator. The spiritual dimension of resistance against Viking expansion remains perhaps the most difficult aspect for modern observers to fully appreciate. Yet, contemporary sources suggest it was central to the forest people's success. While we might view their shamanic practices and nature-based spiritual systems through a lens of anthropological interest, to the Vikings, these represented genuinely frightening supernatural threats. The Norse worldview, while certainly including magical elements, was fundamentally different from the animistic spirituality of the forest cultures. The Vikings recognized the power of magic seer in Old Norse, but generally associated it with specific practitioners rather than seeing the entire landscape as spiritually alive. Forest peoples, by contrast, maintained spiritual systems where trees, stones, animals, and natural features were understood to house spirits or possess consciousness. The worldview that made the forest itself an active participant in resistance. Archaeological evidence from sacred sites throughout the forest belt reveals sophisticated ritual practices centered around natural features. In Finland, sacred groves or high-is were locations where communities made offerings to forest spirits and ancestors. Similar sacred spaces have been identified in Baltic and Sámi territories. These were not merely ceremonial locations, but spiritual strongholds, places where forest peoples believed they could access supernatural powers to defend their lands. The material culture associated with these spiritual practices would have appeared profoundly alien to Norse observers. Ritual objects recovered from bog deposits and sacred sites include masks combining human and animal features, effigies made from twisted roots and branches, and carved staffs adorned with symbols representing spirit helpers or supernatural entities. When deployed in the context of resistance shamans wearing such masks while leading defenders, ritual objects placed along Viking paths as spiritual barriers, these would have reinforced Norse perceptions of facing supernatural opposition. The psychological impact of these spiritual differences appears repeatedly in Norse sources. Egil's saga describes an encounter with Finnish sorcerers whose curses caused illness among Norse raiders. The saga takes these supernatural claims at face value, suggesting that even the historically minded authors of these accounts accepted the reality of forest magic. Similarly, the saga at Eric the Red mentions trollwomen, likely a reference to female shamans among the Sámi, who could slam and hole and spit out their bones, ein mythologized but revealing description of the fear these spiritual practitioners inspired. Forest peoples appear to have deliberately amplified these supernatural associations as a defensive strategy. Archaeological evidence suggests that ritual performances often accompanied military actions against Vikings, not merely as religious ceremonies, but as psychological warfare designed to unnerve enemy. The placement of ritual objects along likely Viking routes, the use of sound drums, bullroarers, and other instruments whose remains have been found at several sites to create disorienting effects, and the strategic deployment of spiritual practitioners during confrontations all suggest a sophisticated understanding of how to exploit Norse fears. Perhaps most significant was the forest peoples' ability to merge spiritual and practical resistance so thoroughly that Vikings could not distinguish between natural hazards and supernatural threats. When Norse expeditions became lost in forests, was it poor navigation or the work of spirits confusing their path? When illness struck a raiding party, was it natural disease or a shaman's curse? This uncertainty created a compounding psychological burden that made forest territories increasingly unattractive targets for Norse expansion. To the Vikings, this was not just war. It was sacrilege. They weren't just fighting people, they were passing into a living, breathing realm of gods far older than Odin. The clash between Viking and forest was never purely physical. It was also a war of worldviews. The Norse believed the cosmos was divided into ordered realms, each ruled by gods who mirrored the hierarchy of men. Their power came from weapons, oaths, and conquest. Fight for the forest peoples. The land itself was divine. Every tree was an ancestor, every river a spirit, every mountain a memory older than humanity. This fundamental difference transformed even the smallest skirmish into a sacred act of defiance. Some Viking accounts speak of warriors refusing to strike first blows in these woods, fearing the wrath of spirits that watch from roots and stones. Others described sudden storms that broke raids apart, storms they believed had been called by shamans who could command the weather. In Finnish tradition, the no-ida were said to drum themselves into trances so deep they could send their souls ahead of the war party to confuse their enemies. Whether these tales were truth or terror minus fueled exaggeration mattered little. They worked. Archaeological discoveries suggest that forest shamans deliberately blurred the line between religion and war. Actual staffs ground with animal skulls were planted along paths like invisible wards. Effigies carved from twisted roots were hung from branches, their grotesque faces staring down at approaching invaders. The bones were arranged in spiral patterns across clearings meant to disorient those who stumbled upon them. For outsiders, these were signs of dark sorcery, and that was precisely the point. For the Vikings, whose courage was rooted in the favor of their gods, fighting in such a landscape felt like fighting against the gods themselves. Their prayers to Odin often seemed unanswered beneath the ancient canopy, while the forest warriors fought with the unshakable confidence of those who believed the land itself fought beside them. And perhaps it did, because here, the battlefield wasn't just trees and earth. It was a sacred being, and it had tough on its side. The spiritual dimension of resistance also helped forest communities maintain cohesion and purpose during extended conflicts. Archaeological evidence suggests increased ritual activity during periods of Viking incursion, including communal ceremonies that would have reinforced group identity and resolve. While Vikings certainly had their own religious practices to bolster courage, they were operating in spiritually foreign territory where their gods seemed less present and less powerful, a significant psychological disadvantage on facing determined resistance. The fire had burned low, casting more shadows than light over the huddled remains of the Viking expedition. Of the 30 warriors who had ventured into the forest 5 days earlier, only 11 remained. The others had been taken one by one, some by arrows that seemed to materialize from nowhere, others by spears thrust through the darkness, and some simply vanishing during their watch, leaving nothing but footprints that ended inexplicably in the middle of open ground. Sigurd the Red sat slightly apart from the others, running a whetstone along the edge of his axe with mechanical precision. 20 years he had raided across the known world. From the stone fortresses of the Franks to the rich monasteries of Ireland, he had faced shield walls and cavalry charges, had scaled city walls under showers of arrows. None of it had prepared him for the slow, grinding terror of the forest. "I should never have come to this cursed place," muttered Harold, the youngest of the survivors. His eyes darted constantly toward the darkness beyond their small clearing. "My father told me tales of these woods. He said the trees themselves walk at night, that the forest people can turn into wolves when the moon is high." "Silence," Sigurd growled. "They are men, nothing more. Men who know these woods better than we do." But even as he spoke the words, doubt not at him. He had seen things in the past 5 days that defied explanation. A warrior who appeared to step out of the trunk of an ancient oak. Footprints that changed from human to wolf and back again. Eyes watching from the darkness that reflected no light, yet somehow gleamed with an inner fire. Listen, his dull for suddenly. They fell silent, straining to hear whatever had alarmed their scout. At first, Sigurd heard nothing but the normal sounds of the night forest, the rustle of leaves, the occasional call of a night bird. Then he caught it. The rhythm beneath these natural sounds, so faint it might have been the beating of its own heart, yet somehow separate. A drum, he realized. No, many drums, their beats overlapping like ripples in a pond. "They're coming," Harold whispered, panic edging his voice. "No," said Ulfar, his face pale in the dying firelight. "They're already here. They've been here all along." As if in response to his words, the drumming grew louder, no longer trying to disguise itself among the forest sounds. With it came voices, a chant in a language none of them recognized, wrathing and flying like the wind through the branches. Sigurd stood, axe ready, peering into the darkness. "Form a circle," he commanded. "Backs together. Whatever comes, we face it as Vikings." They obeyed. These last survivors of what had been meant as a simple raid on a forest settlement. Proud warriors reduced to frightened men in a circle, jumping at shadows. The chanting stopped abruptly, leaving a silence more terrifying than any sound. Then, from the darkness, a voice spoke in heavily accented Norse. "You came seeking easy prey, seem Einus wolf. You found instead the hunters of the forest." A figure stepped into the fading circle of firelight. Foul, adorned with bones and feathers, face painted with swirling patterns that seemed to move in the flickering light. Behind this shaman, other chiefs became visible warriors with spears and bows, their bodies painted to blend with the forest, their eyes reflecting the dying fire like those of predatory animals. "We could kill you now," the shaman continued, "as we killed your companions. But instead, we will let you carry a message back to your people." Sigurd tightened his grip on his axe, measuring the distance between himself and the strange figure, calculating his chances of reaching him before the archers could loose their arrows. As if reading his thoughts, the shaman smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "Your death minus thoughts are loud. See mine as wolf. But tonight is not your night to die." He raised a staff out with what Sigurd realized with horror was a human skull, the skull of their expedition's leader, still recognizable by the golden tooth that gleamed in the firelight. "Tell your people that the forest remembers those who harm it. Tell them that we are always watching, always waiting. The trees have long memories, and we are the keepers of those memories." The shaman made a gesture, and his warriors melted back into the darkness like morning mist. If only he remained, his painted face the last thing visible as he backed away from the firelight. "Follow the rising sun," his voice came from the darkness. "It will lead you back to your ships. Never return to these forests. Next time, the trees will drink your blood to the last drop." Kenhichu was gone, leaving only the night sounds of the forest and the terrified breathing of the surviving Vikings. Sigurd stood frozen, his legendary courage momentarily abandoned. For the first time in his life, he understood true fear, not the fleeting terror of battle, but the deep, primal dread of facing something beyond his comprehension. "We leave at first light," he said finally, his voice steadier than he felt. "We take the shaman's offer." No one argued. They had come seeking wealth and glory. They would leave with neither, carrying instead a message, and memories that would haunt their dreams for years to come. The forest had won. The legacy of forest resistance against Viking expansion extends far beyond the Viking Age itself, shaping the cultural and political development of northern and eastern Europe in ways that continue to resonate today. While the Vikings ultimately established trade networks and settlements throughout much of Europe, the forest belt remained largely unconnected, a testament to the effectiveness of indigenous resistance strategies. This successful resistance created what historians now recognize as a crucial cultural frontier that influenced European development for centuries. In regions where forest peoples effectively maintained their independence, distinctive cultural traditions survive that might otherwise have been subsumed by Norse influence. The modern cultural diversity of northeastern Europe with Finnish, Estonian, Sámi, and Baltic languages and traditions remaining distinct from Germanic and Slavic neighbor shows much to this early resistance. Archaeological evidence reveals how forest societies were transformed by the conflict, even as they successfully resisted conquest. Defensive innovations developed to counter Viking threats, from fortification techniques to weapons technology, became permanent features of forest cultures. Settlement patterns shifted toward more defensible locations, and political structures evolved toward greater centralization and military organization. These changes accelerated the development of what would eventually become distinct national identities. The psychological impact of successful resistance appears in the folklore and mythology of forest cultures, where stories of outwitting powerful invaders became foundational cultural narratives. Fuchs' epic poet were preserved, and the Kaliva contains numerous references to conflicts with northern raiders that likely reflect historical memories of Viking incursions. Similar motifs appear in Estonian, Sámi, and Baltic folklore. The clever forest dweller defeating physically stronger, less cunning outsiders became a recurring theme that reinforced cultural identity. For Viking societies, the experience of being effectively resisted shaped their expansion patterns and contributed to significant cultural adaptations. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests, but after initial military failures, Norse interactions with forest peoples shifted increasingly toward trade rather than conquest. Viking trading posts established along the forest frontier became important cultural contact zones where ideas, technologies, and beliefs flowed in both directions. This cultural exchange had profound implications. The Norse traders operating in forest territories adopted local survival techniques, spiritual protective practices, and material culture elements that helped them navigate these challenging environments. Some of these adaptations made their way back to Scandinavia proper, influencing Norse culture more broadly. Archaeological findings from late Viking Age settlements show increasing incorporation of design elements and technologies from forest cultures, particularly in areas related to cold weather survival and woodland resource exploitation. The religious dimension of this legacy is particularly significant. The Scandinavia gradually Christianized in the late Viking Age. The forest frontier remained a stronghold of indigenous spiritual practices. Archaeological evidence shows that traditional sacred sites in Finland, Estonia, and Sámi territories continued to be used well into the medieval period and sometimes beyond. The persistence of these spiritual traditions created a religious frontier that paralleled the cultural one, influencing how Christianity eventually developed in these regions when it did arrive. Perhaps most significantly, the successful resistance of forest peoples against Viking expansion created alternative models of development that challenged the dominant narrative of medieval European history. While much of Western Europe experienced a pattern of conquest, assimilation, and feudalization, the forest belt demonstrated that other paths were possible, ones based on adaptation, resilience, and the strategic use of environmental advantages. The modern nations that emerged from these forest territories, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, carry this legacy of successful resistance in their cultural DNA. The national narratives often emphasize themes of persistence against powerful outside forces, cultural continuity despite pressure to assimilate, and deep connection to forest landscapes that provided both physical resources and spiritual strength during critical historical moments. The old man sat by the fire, his face deeply lined with age, his blind eyes milky white, yet somehow still alert as they turned toward the children gathered around him. Akfeg the Wayan house, a winter storm held across the Finnish Firth. But here, in the warmth of the hearth, Tang seemed suspended as the village's oldest inhabitant prepared to share memories that stretched back almost a century. Tell us about the sea-wolves, grandfather urged a young boy, perhaps 10 summers old. Tell us how our ancestors drove them from our forests. The old man smiled, his gnarled hands reaching for the ceremonial cup of birch-sap beer that was his right. As the village storyteller, he drank deeply, then set the vessel aside. The Northmen came in the time of my grandfather's grandfather. He began, his voice surprisingly strong despite his years. They came in ships with dragon heads and square sails, up the rivers that lead to our lakes. They came with iron swords and silver around their arms, with shields painted bright as autumn leaves, and hearts full of hunger for what was not theirs. The children leaned closer, though they had heard versions of this tale many times before. It was their history, their inheritance. They thought our forests would fall to them as other lands had fallen. They thought our people would bow as other people had bowed. The old man's blind eyes seemed to see across the decades, across the generations. They did not understand that the forest itself was our strongest warrior, our most faithful ally. He reached for a small drum that lay beside him, a shaman's drum, its surface painted with symbols that connected the world of men to the world of spirits. With fingers still nimble despite their knotted joints, he began a soft rhythmic tapping. We had not fight as they fought with shield walls and battle cries. We became the forest. We moved as silently as foxes. He watched in the branches like owls. We struck like lightning and disappeared like morning mist. The drum beat quickened slightly, matching the pace of his words. Their strength became their weakness in our woods. Their heavy armor dragged them into bogs. Their bright shields made them targets among the trees. Their loud voices told us when they were from miles away. He smiled again, a fierce expression that transformed his elderly face, offering a glimpse of the warrior he had once been. My own grandfather fought them in his youth. He took me to the place where the great battle happened, where hundreds of Northmen entered the forest, but only handfuls emerged. The trees there grew taller, he said, nourished by the blood of invaders. The old man's drum fell silent. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper that made the children strain to hear. "They fear our forest still. These men from across the sea. They come to trade, bringing silver and iron, taking our furs and amber. They speak friendly words from Casaflet. Watch their eyes when they look toward the deep woods. The fear remains. They remember what their sagas tell them that here in these ancient forests, the Northmen met something they could not defeat." Reached out his hand, finding the shoulder of the boy who had requested the tale. "This is why we remember. This is why we keep the old ways, honor the forest spirits, maintain the sacred groves. Not just because it is our tradition, but because it saved us when nothing else could have done so. The forest protected us. We must always protect the forest." Outside, the wind seemed to respond to his words, rising to a howl that rattled the wooden shutters. The children glanced nervously toward the sound, but the old man smiled. "Do not fear," he said softly. "That's just the forest, reminding us that it still watches, still remembers. As long as these trees stand, but people cannot truly be conquered." The resistance of forest peoples against Viking expansion offers profound insights that transcend its historical context, speaking to universal themes of asymmetric conflict, cultural resilience, and the relationship between humans and their environments. Their success demonstrates how intimate knowledge of local terrain, combined with adaptable tactics and strong cultural cohesion, can overcome seemingly insurmountable military advantages. Throughout history, similar patterns have emerged whenever technologically advanced societies have encountered indigenous peoples with deep environmental knowledge. The forest strategies that confounded Viking warriors disappearing into seemingly impossible terrain, using the environment itself as a weapon, striking at psychological vulnerabilities have been employed by resistant cultures across continents and centuries. What makes the forest people's resistance particularly remarkable is that it occurred during a period when Viking expansion seemed unstoppable elsewhere. While monasteries burned across Western Europe and established kingdoms paid tribute to Norse raiders, the forest belt remained largely unconnected, testament to the effectiveness of these indigenous defensive systems. The archaeological record continues to reveal new dimensions of this resistance. Recent excavations at sites across Finland, Estonia, and Latvia have uncovered sophisticated defensive works that challenge traditional views of these societies as primitive or technologically limited. The evidence suggests communities that were rapidly innovating in response to external threats, developing new weapons, fortification techniques, and organizational structures specifically designed to counter Viking advantages. Perhaps most significantly, the forest peoples' resistance reminds us that history is not simply a story of conquest and submission. For every empire that expanded, there were peoples who successfully maintained their independence through ingenuity, determination, and strategic adaptation. These stories often receive less attention in historical narratives focused on great powers, yet they represent an equally important aspect of human experience. The forests that once sheltered these resistant cultures have changed over the centuries, reduced by agriculture, altered by climate shifts, managed for timber production. Yet, in the northern reaches of Europe, vast woodlands still remain. Their silent trees, the descendants of those that witnessed the clash between seafarers and forest dwellers over 1,000 years ago. In modern Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuanian nations that emerged from these forest territories, cultural memory of resistance remains embedded in national identities. Annual celebrations still honor ancient defensive sites. Traditional practices connected to forest spirituality continue in modified forms. The forest remains a powerful symbol in art, literature, and music, not merely as a natural resource, but as a cultural touchstone representing resilience against external pressure. For the Vikings, the forest peoples represented their most significant failure of expansion, a rare instance where Norse military prowess proved inadequate against determined resistance. This failure ultimately redirected Viking energies toward trade rather than conquest in these regions, creating relationships at exchange rather than domination that would shape Northern European development for centuries. The forest still stands. The trees still watch, and in their silent presence, we can glimpse the shadows of those who once moved among them, the forgotten defenders who transformed their woodland home into an unconquerable fortress against one of history's most feared military powers. The forests remember, even when human histories forget, and in that memory lies a powerful testament to human ingenuity, cultural resilience, and the enduring strength of peoples who refuse to surrender their ancestral ways to the terror from the sea. Stand at the edge of any ancient woodland in Finland, Estonia, or the Baltic states. Feel the silence envelop you as you step beneath the canopy of pine and birch. Watch how the light changes, filtering through countless leaves to create patterns of shadow and illumination on the forest floor. Listen to the subtle sounds, the whisper of wind through branches, the distant tap of a woodpecker, the soft rustle of unseen creatures moving through undergrowth. Now imagine yourself a Viking warrior 1,000 years ago, venturing into this green labyrinth. The familiar horizon of the open sea is replaced by endless trees, the reassuring presence of your longship and fellow readers left behind as you push deeper into territory where your vaunted fighting skills suddenly seem inadequate, even irrelevant. Every shadow might conceal a defender. Every sound might signal an ambush. The forest itself seems alive, watching, waiting aghast, patient entity allied with those who know its ways and hostile to those who do not. This was the psychological reality that confronted Norse raiders who ventured into the forest belt of northern and eastern Europe. Their sagas and chronicles, while often focused on their conquests, contain these quieter stories of failure expeditions that never returned, settlements that could not be established, territories that remained unconquered despite repeated attempts. The forest peoples who successfully resisted Viking expansion left fewer written records of their victories. Yet, their legacy lives on in archaeological remains, in cultural traditions that survived centuries of subsequent pressure, and in the very existence of distinct nations and peoples who might otherwise have been absorbed into expanding their territories. Their story reminds us that history is not simply a chronicle of the powerful imposing their will upon the weak. It is also the story of resistance, adaptation, and survival against overwhelming odds of cultures that found ways to transform apparent disadvantages into decisive strengths. The Vikings, masters of the open sea and feared throughout Europe, found their match in the shadows beneath ancient trees. There, the hunters became the hunted. There, the conquerors became the conquered. There, the forest peoples transformed themselves from prey into the demons that haunt Norse nightmares. The forests still stand in Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, changed by time, but unbroken in their essential nature. And somewhere in their depths, perhaps the spirits of those ancient defenders still move silently among the trees, still watching the horizons for approaching sails, still ready to protect what is theirs. The forest remembers, even when we forget. And in that memory lies a powerful truth that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in imposing one's will upon the world, but in becoming so thoroughly part of one's environment that no external force can truly conquer it. Empires rise and fall. Warriors come and go, but the forest, patient, ancient, and eternal, waits for no conqueror. It's wise them all in remembering their footsteps long after they are dying. If the Viking age taught Europe anything, it was that power is not always measured by the sharpness of a sword or the size of an army. The true power sometimes wears no crown, builds no cities, and marches under no banner. That hides in the soil beneath centuries man's old pines, in the silent knowledge of hunters can know every path and stream, in the unbreakable bond between people and the land that sustains them. The same Inus kings believed that strength was the ability to dominate, to seize, to rule, to reshape the world in their image. The forest peoples showed them another kind of strength, the ability to endure. They proved that a society woven into the fabric of its environment cannot be uprooted by iron and fire. It bends, it adapts, and when the conqueror is gone, it remains. Even now, if you walk beneath the same trees that once watched Viking raiders vanish into their shadows, You can almost feel the weight of that memory pressing in from all sides. The Eastwoods do not speak aloud, but they do not forget, and in their silence lies a lesson that echoes across 1,000 years, that the greatest victories in history are not always those written by the conquerors, but those whispered by the survivors who refuse to be broken. The forest still remembers. But will we?